Well, welcome back, everybody. This has been a wonderful conference already after our first panel. For those who are just joining, I am Mark Alexander. I'm the Arthur J. Kania Dean at the Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law. I'm also the president of the Association of American Law Schools, and glad to be part of this program, which has been led by Dean Erwin Chemerinsky at UC Berkeley. But glad to be, I guess we are, Erwin's been in the lead and I've been his co-chair making it happen. But ultimately, just trying to make sure that we are of service to all of those folks here on this call and to all law schools, law faculty, law school administrators in the wake of obviously a very important U.S. Supreme Court decision. As I mentioned in the first panel, what I think is important is that we often, of course, as law schools, we engage in a conversation about what the law is, what the law should be, et cetera. And we also often engage in conversations about important decisions that are very much in the public eye. What I think distinguishes this case is that there's another dimension of this. This is a case which is directly about what we do. We educate our students, and we don't have students unless we admit students. So this case deals specifically with questions of how race is used in the context of admissions. And so I'm very pleased to have a wonderful panel for this next discussion. And we're fundamentally asking the question of what's next? Where do we go from here? And I think that's a key question. And so, the concern we have here is not just to look at this in an abstract legal context, but to think about what are we going to actually do to move forward after these decisions. Let me introduce our panelists here. We're very fortunate. As I'm just looking at my screen, I'll introduce first, I'll do brief introductions and we'll jump into conversations. Cristina Arteaga, who joined the University of Washington School of Law in 2016 as the assistant director for admissions, and has been the assistant dean of admissions and financial aid since 2019. She manages the admissions and recruitment process, administers a scholarship program, and counsels prospective students. She earned her bachelor's from UC Berkeley and a master's degree in higher education from UCLA. She's been in admissions for 14 years at the University of Washington, of course, and also the University of Utah. So welcome, Cristina. Also, as I'm looking at my screen, I'll mention we have Cary Lee Cluck, who is the Assistant Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at the University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law. She previously served in administration at University of Mississippi School of Law for 15 years as Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and then Assistant Dean for Admission and Scholarship. She earned her JD from the University of Mississippi and is currently a PhD candidate. Can't get enough of the education there. Cary, good for you. A candidate for PhD in higher education. She also is a clerk in Mississippi, has been in Washington, D.C., and has a wide variety, as all of our panelists do, a wide variety of interesting experience that she brings to this conversation. And last but not least, certainly we have Kristin Theis-Alvarez, who's a dean of admissions and financial aid at the University of California, Berkeley. So she has the great distinction of working on a daily basis with one Erwin Chemerinsky. That is, I'm sure, the highlight of her career. But in addition to that, she did graduate from UC Berkeley, getting her BA in rhetoric, I guess with high honors in rhetoric and Native American studies, her JD from Stanford. She has worked in various contexts. She is a coordinator for the Building Young Minds Scholarship Program for Habitat Humanity East Bay. She's worked in law school admissions and financial aid at Berkeley Law since 2007. So as you can see, we have a group of panelists who are all deeply engaged in this field. And what brings us together is that they all are in states that have for a long time been dealing with legal statewide legal realms that define how race may be used in admissions in a way that has often been more restrictive of what has been the standards across the country. And now that we have a Supreme Court decision that restricts the use of race in admissions. The question is, at this point, I think the fundamental question is, if your school has an interest in diversity in the student population, after this decision, how might you go forward? And thinking about that from the perspective of these individuals who have actually done that. Now, of course, there's still a question as to how do we interpret exactly what the court's decision is, which I'm happy to hear thoughts about that. But also, I think I want to just have a conversation about what do we think, what can we learn from you, from your experiences that you have had, from how you achieve diversity in your schools, where that is one of the values that you have, with legal constraints from your own states laws, propositions, et cetera. So with that, hopefully not too long introduction, I'd be happy to open up for any quick first round comments. I know that our great panelists have actually been talking with each other. We've been going back and forth in email, so I want to make a good discussion. And I will say before I turn it over, and I'll just I can go I'll go to Cristina, Cary, and then Kristin for a couple of minutes. Also, I'll tell everyone in attendance here, you can put your questions in the Q&A. Okay, so if you have a question, put in the Q&A. I will try to get through them as much as possible. We had an overflow, 25, 30 questions in the last session. We could not get to all of them. We'll get to as many as possible. This is also a conversation that is not ending today. So if you want to start out, Cristina, with just a couple of quick comments, and I'll leave it to you now.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction. Well, I think kind of my initial thoughts are that this is really an opportunity to educate everyone at the law school and really all of our stakeholders about what this will mean for our process, and to educate them about what our policies and processes are and to prepare them for the challenges that will come. I think the more that our community understands what the work that we do, the more they'll come to understand how they can be involved in any solutions moving forward.
Excellent. Quick, to the point there, look at solutions. Cary. I'm sorry, also Cary or Cary Lee, do we prefer?
Cary. Of course, there are some listeners who would say Cary Lee, but that's okay. Thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate it. I think my opening remarks are, I want to come at this from a place of positivity. We've been here before, a lot of us, a lot of my fellow admissions deans and directors have been in this place before because we've been working in this profession for a really long time. So it's really all about thinking about what we did after Grutter and Gratz came down years ago. And for people who are newer to the profession, you have colleagues, you have us, not just the panelists today, but there are plenty of us who've been working in this space for a really long time and use this as a resource. And there are lots of other resources out there, and I think we'll talk about some of them today. But I just want to be positive and say we've looked at this before and we've figured out solutions, and we'll do it again.
Thank you. Kristin.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kristin Theis-Alvarez, my pronouns are she, her. I have been at Berkeley since 2007, but as you mentioned, Mark, my relationship with Berkeley extends much farther than that. And part of what I want to bring is just a perspective that's sort of a long view, including that infuses both the professional perspective and a personal perspective. So I came to Berkeley as an undergrad in 1993. When there was affirmative action, I applied to law school in 1996, when affirmative action had just ended. And I came back to Berkeley because for exactly the reason that you mentioned that we're all here today, which is public service. And I do agree with both of my colleagues that that's the reason that we're interested in having these conversations and the reason that we continue the work to do the work that we do. If this was sort of a, soul crushing, doom spiral, I think all of us would have opted out long ago. And instead we've chosen to attempt to be problem solvers. I don't want anyone to walk away with a sense that we're going to tell you how to do it and it's going to be a fix, or you're going to see maybe a rough year and then a total rebound. It's been very up and down, as one might expect, in terms of the diversity of the class, but we're happy to provide tips, tricks, context, and ideas for what worked and what didn't work for anyone to take back to approach being solution-oriented at their own schools.
Okay, so I guess I would start out with the fundamental premise here. I guess a couple of points. First, we are dealing with a situation where, of course, we have the Supreme Court has declared the proper interpretation as they see it of the Constitution as it applies to admissions, and we all need to be compliant with the law. And so, to the extent that many of us law schools, and obviously we're talking about law schools today, you know, it certainly could apply to other programs, but to the extent that law schools, if we have a value that we hold to have a diverse classroom setting, diverse school overall, our values have not changed during because what the Supreme Court declared, but the question is going to be how to move forward to be compliant in the context. So I guess of the new Supreme Court decision, I guess if I could just for 1 minute have it be that as we lay the foundation, could each of you briefly say how it is that you have been dealing with something you may see as analogous to what the Supreme Court has said recently, to the extent that the Supreme Court has restricted the use of race in admissions now, but you have faced that in your three states, Washington, Arizona, and California. So I'm happy for any of the three of you to lead off, or should I'll go, I think, backwards. Where'd I go? Cary Lee first. We'll go back to you.
Sure. And I don't, my colleagues and I met and we kind of have some of the same thoughts. I don't want to repeat everybody, but I'll say one thing, make sure that you have good policies and procedures in place, very definitive policies and procedures, both internally with your admissions committee, but then whatever you have forward facing your application and those types of things. So really good policies, I think, are key in approaching this issue.
Okay. And let me just follow up. And so what were the restraints you statutorily that you were facing?
I think that our law is pretty similar to most of the state laws on the books, and it prohibits preferential treatment at the point of admission and at the point of offering a scholarship to an applicant.
Right. And is that the same then, I would say, for Kristin and Cristina, basically the same kind of state constraints that you had previously, or is there something to add to that? Obviously, each state is different, but
I can just give you the context for California if it helps frame this. So California passed Proposition 2009, and it amended the California state constitution. So Section 31 was added, and Section 31A says that the state should not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. So that's sort of the explicit language that shapes this. And I think they're probably fairly similar, because if you know the history of Proposition 209 and all of these propositions, you know that there's a single person or a group of people who sort of had a template that they, sort of shopped around to various states after California. I also think it's important to know, however, that there was a proposition in 2020, Prop 16, that would have overturned Prop 209, and it was really resoundingly defeated in California. So this is not, something that I think as voters of the state have sort of grown beyond or past. 57% of the voters in California voted no on Prop 16, which would have directly repealed Prop 209.
We had a very similar experience in Washington. So our initiative, I-200, was passed in 1998. And in 2020, there was an initiative to repeal that. And it was also voted down by the state.
Thank you. So, so to the extent that schools are now moving forward, and obviously moving forward in the wake of a very recent decision, and what in terms of, I guess, next steps, let me just talk about process just for a second. Stay with you, Cristina. What would you say as schools are reviewing admissions policies? Who should be involved in that process? Let's talk about process, and then we're going to get into substance a little bit. So who do we need to involve? Of course, we all know we need our lawyers involved.
Right. Yeah, so we recently we had a charge from our dean about a year ago to revisit our admissions policy and our admissions process. And so we brought a committee together that was made up of faculty members, admissions folks, both from the JD and the graduate programs or LLM programs, but also folks who work with our students once they're in school. So our dean of students was also on the committee, as well as our director of our public service program. So it was a pretty big diverse group of people who came together to, one, review our policies, to review our holistic admissions policies and see what could be updated. Is there any language that could be discouraging? Can we change language to be more encouraging and to be more inclusive when students are taking a look at our program? And aside from just our admissions policy, they also reviewed our application, taking a close look at our questions. What else? What are we not asking? If we are asking a certain question, why? Is there anything that, again, could be discouraging to a student? So it was a very long process. It took us quite a while to get through it. It took a lot of discussion, a lot of work, but we finally, we revised our policy. It's now on our website. So we want to make it very clear to anyone who's looking at our school of what our holistic admissions policy is. And I think that is helpful for the student. The more clear you can be about what your actual policy is, I think that helps them craft the best application as well. I think sometimes students are very confused about what is holistic admissions and what are you looking at and what does that mean? And the more you can clarify that in your process, I think the more encouraging and helpful it is to the student to see themselves as a good applicant for your program, because you're looking at a variety of areas. I think the more general the policy, the harder it can be for the student to understand what it is that your school is looking for.
Great. Any follow-up to that from either of you?
No, I think you're probably going to find that it's fairly similar, and it's likely what people are grappling with right now. We too had a faculty-led committee led by a sort of beloved faculty member, Bob Cole, but involving many other people that took a really deep dive. And I think, to Christina's point, I would maybe just add that there's at least sort of 4 prongs of that response, or focus areas, I should say. One is the policy itself. One is the process for reviewing applications, which is distinct from the policy guiding and governing it. A third is the tool, so the application itself, or any other tools that you're using. And then 4 is some set of other tools or a strategic plan that leads to a period or sustained but constant assessment. So data becomes really, really important. And obviously it's not driving decision-making, but doing reflective look backs at the previous cycle or the previous several cycles to understand where things are working, where things aren't working, also becomes an area that requires deep investment. We put our faculty policy governing admissions on the website. You can look at it, you can Google it, anybody can look at it. I mean, we're a public school anyway, so anybody could ask for it. But I also think that as I look at it, and it's been nearly 30 years, one of the things that's sort of genius about it is it stands the test of time. And I looked at it really carefully in response, obviously, to this decision. It talks about us as a public institution and our responsibility and role. It says it completely explicitly that in making admissions decisions, the school gives substantial weight to numerical indicators, yet numbers alone are not dispositive. And it talks about some of the other things that we might consider. It also says if it appears that an applicant has experienced disadvantage, it will be considered in evaluating his or her past performance and assessing their potential. It talks about why explicitly and with some specificity we seek a student body with a broad set of interests, backgrounds, life experiences, and perspectives, and why it's important in a law school to have those things. And we talk about the kinds of graduates that we've historically produced and our desire to be of service, and to continue to select students who attain the highest standards of professional excellence, integrity, as well as bring vision, creativity, and commitment to all professional endeavors. So I think it doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly lengthy, but I think it should be approachable and legible to sort of an average 19-year-old who's thinking about going to law school, as well as sort of stand, obviously, the scrutiny that would come from the fallout of this decision.
Right. So to continue on that point there, talking about what is known to the public, I think that transparency is an important question here. So let me, I guess I'll just follow up to you, Kristin, just to say, why do you think transparency is important in this context? And I'm happy then to ask either if either of the two of you want to follow up on that.
I mean, from my perspective, transparency is important for a couple of reasons. One is it's very useful in developing things in California to understand that they're very likely to see the light of day, right? And to your point that we are all engaged in being legal educators and complying with the law, whatever you're doing, if it's on the front page of the New York Times, you should feel good about that and comfortable with it. And to do otherwise is probably a good reason to look more carefully if it's something that you would be worried about people knowing about. The other is obviously a consumer information, a consumer protection role. One of the things that's very, very true is that the short-term response to 209 was a sort of cataclysmic lack of diversity enrollment at the University of California, Berkeley. For a variety of reasons, not just because of what the school was doing, but also because of what the public was saying and what advisors were advising. But it's also true that for many underrepresented students walking into an environment where they're unsure how they're going to be seen, valued, respected, treated, and engaged with is deeply anxiety provoking and may not make a place somewhere that they want to be. But I also just think fundamentally there's this rumor, and I cannot push back on it hard enough, that what law schools care about is LSAT and GPA, and maybe extracurriculars, and then maybe a plus factor that's race, right? That's the driving four-part value system that led us down this path. And that's just not the case. So to say that really loudly and clearly becomes really important, for us to say numbers are not dispositive, and to be looking at how to increase applications sort of at the very top of the funnel becomes incredibly important. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, and let me follow up to your colleagues. I think that one thing which is important is talking about numbers aren't the be all and end all. We can certainly compare LSATs across thousands of students, GPAs across thousands of schools, but I would ask for either of you, whoever, I'll turn to Cary Lee next. What would you say? How do you decide, or what is important? We talk about race in admissions. We talk about legacies. We talk about special interest candidates. We talk about folks who may be military, people who may be athletes, geographic. There's just all these different things. So how do you think we can define or consider, or how do you consider the different ways in which we might look at a student besides just saying you are a X on the LSAT, X GPA?
Actually spend time talking about that very thing in a different context when I'm recruiting with some colleagues of mine, and we're talking about holistic file review and how admissions committees look at records. The thing that how I couch this to prospective applicants is, when I'm reading your file, when my committee is reading your file, we're looking for reasons to bring you into our community. We're not looking for reasons to exclude you from our community. And I think that touches back on the point that Kristin made, that the rumor is we are just numbers driven. And so I say that to say we're not. We're looking at all of the pieces of who you present to us in your application. And I think that's an important message to deliver. I may have not, maybe didn't fully answer your question.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's the, I would say the beauty of today is that there's not one question or one definitive answer.
True.
But I think that that part of what I do want us to think about, and I'll turn to Cristina as well, is what, and I think you did speak to it. Well, what is holistic review? What is this review of a candidate? And obviously each school does it differently. But what is it? I guess maybe just to ask the broader question: if I'm a college student applying to law school, what are you looking for? I guess that's part of the question. So I'll let you elaborate some more on that, Cristina.
Yes, very similar to what Cary mentioned, we really talk about the whole person, right? We talk about, we want to know your story and to think of your application as a puzzle, right? Everything has to come together to give us a full picture of who you are as an applicant. In terms of our process, I encourage our committee to read the personal statements first before getting to the transcripts and the LSAT score, to get to know the applicant, right? Because that's what we say, we want to get to know you and learn a little bit more about them, because that can then help put into context what that LSAT score is, or maybe what that GPA is. And definitely training your committee is incredibly important in assessing that LSAT and GPA isn't the entire story, right? You really have to take a deep dive into what is their educational history, where their ups and downs, how many times did they take the LSAT? Did they give that context for why maybe they had to retake the exam, or why they had to take a break from school? So it's important to really educate students to make sure that they tell us that whole story, because sometimes they do hold back. And I think especially for some students who feel that the resume isn't as professional because they didn't intern at a law firm or work at a corporation during school, that their job at Starbucks isn't worthwhile. And so it takes a lot of education to tell students, we want to know everything about you. And that means, did you work at Starbucks 40 hours a week and go to school full time? That's incredibly important for us to know. And so that's where we really try to educate the student to give us that piece of themselves, so that when our committee does read that personal statement and review the resume first, they have a lot of information already to really put into context what that GPA and LSAT mean.
That's very helpful. And I would follow up over to Kristin, something we talked about as we were preparing for this. It was interesting. You talked about after these decisions, tool expansion versus tool reduction. I thought that was an interesting way to put it, which I know, again, Cary, I mean, the three of you all have talked about, so much of these parts, but I thought that phrasing was interesting. So Kristin, expand a little bit more about that idea. How to look at things.
I mean, I think where it's sort of a mistake right in the beginning to accept a narrative that says what admissions should be is 3, 4, or 5 factors weighed in some sort of algorithmic approach, as opposed to a holistic one. I mean, it would be fast, but I don't think it really helps anyone, including individual applicants, right? And not just institutions. So I do think that this is a time to be thinking about tool expansion. And a time to be creative. I will piggyback on something my colleague said, just to give you a specific example of kind of what this might look like. A large part of what you'll need to do is to take some time to define what you seek, and it can't be racial diversity, right? I mean, you can want diversity in your classroom, but you can't literally be like, I want the same number of X students as we had last year, right? That's not going to work. And then you should define what you'll consider, right? What you're going to take, what are the factors that inform answering those questions of what am I seeking, and construct a tool, obviously, to collect that information. So a good example is the distinction between GPA or UGPA, undergraduate grade point average, and academic record or academic history. So, a GPA is a number, typically what's talking about is calculated by LSAC, because there's a sort of a norming process that happens there on a 4.0 or 4.0 plus scale. Academic record is something wholly different. It includes where you went to school, what you majored in, the rigor of the course of study, whether you have grade trends that are discernible and come with an explanation, whether or not you were highly prepared to start college or struggled in the first year because of high school that didn't particularly train you well, whether you went to a school that had, very small student body and was very interested in preparing people for graduate school, including law school, or whether you went to a large school where you were sort of an anonymous person trying to make your way through that process. But it also includes things like, do you have a graduate degree? Because if the fundamental question is, are you able to come to our law school and be academically successful? Far more is important than the actual grades that you earned. We're going to look carefully at transcript. What courses did you take? How heavy was the workload? To Cristina's point, what were you doing while you were in those courses? Were you a Division I athlete? Were you a student leader? Were you an employee? Were you a parent? All of those things. And so it becomes much more nuanced, much more interesting, frankly, frankly, much more time consuming from an admissions perspective to take into consideration, and harder to explain in some ways, because it's just much easier to go on Reddit and say that all that matters is, you have a 3.8 versus 3.86. And we just know that's silly. I mean, the same is true with LSAT, given the standard error of measurement on the exam. It's several points in either direction. And even there's plenty of context. So I think the thing is I can't just sort of say that and be doing it secretly behind the scenes. I think you actually need not a policy, but a set of procedures, a handbook, some documented place in which you articulate maybe not the totality of the universe of things you'll consider, but very specific things that you might consider. And then create a tool that allows people to provide them. So we added a question on our application that says, if you do not believe that your undergraduate GPA or your test scores are indicative of your potential for success at Berkeley Law, please tell us why and tell us what is. And one of the things we did in the wake of 209 was to also say, if you have a history of not bad standardized test performance, which is problematic, but of standardized tests being non-predictive for your academic performance, please provide us with a copy of your ACT or SAT score so we can compare it with your academic record and make an assessment of whether or not we think standardized tests are a particularly good measure for you. So there are all kinds of things that could be done, but it does matter that you sort of document and articulate them and have thought about them.
Sure. And let me, I'm not sure if there's it looks like Cristina may have a follow-up, but oh, okay. But actually, one specific question from the Q&A that I will put just to Kristin for a second. Somebody asked if you can send the admissions policy on the website. Is it, I don't know if it is at your fingertips, that you could provide a link that we could put into our webinar chat. If not, no problem. But if so, if we can throw that in there. And oh, look at that. Fast acting, wonderful. We've answered that one question, which I think is important. To follow up on what you were saying, and then I think when we're talking about these questions you are talking about asking, I think this is very important. And I'll turn it over to either the other two folks for a second. But you're talking about the different ways. It sounds like you, and again, from our discussions before, you all want to find out as much as possible about the student who's applying. We all are in a situation where we are faced with large numbers of applications and we can't admit everybody. And we want to figure out how can we find the person who's going to be most successful, I think was the term you're using in their life in law school. So we talked about different tools. Let me ask about, because we have a question in the chat, in the Q&A, about asking for diversity statements. And so the question specifically is, does a decision impact law school admissions ability to ask for diversity statements, or how diversity statements are considered? I think there's part of that question is, what does the court hold? And that was partly really our discussion in the first panel. But I think it is clear from the Chief Justice's comments, it is not prohibited to talk about diversity and race. You can talk about how that has impacted your life, perhaps overcoming discrimination, perhaps inspiring you to do certain things. But I think also then just a question to the two of you about, I guess, whether you want to talk about Arizona or Washington. What about diversity statements as a tool for admissions? Do either of you use them? Both of you? And if what are your thoughts on this?
We don't proactively ask for a diversity statement, but a lot of applicants, it's kind of a part of their package. Especially, I would say I've seen an increase in maybe the past 5 years, the past 5 cycles. And so it's another piece of the puzzle, as Cristina mentioned earlier, that we take into consideration when we are reading the application. They're not always about race, racial discrimination, or gender discrimination. They can be a diversity statement about a lot of different things. I've seen a wide variety of topics that people have addressed in what they call a diversity statement. So they are very useful in the application process. I know a lot of schools also ask a question, why X law school? Why this law school are you applying to? And that's also another really good tool, as Kristin calls them, for applicants to be able to have access to as well.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, see, at Washington, we also don't explicitly ask for a diversity statement, but one of our optional statements is it's pretty broad, and it asks what life events or experiences have had the greatest influence in shaping your character and why. And so that allows students to really go in a lot of different directions. And so many students will use that to talk about diversity, adversity, or other events that have happened in their life that they feel would add to the experience here.
And let me just follow up on that. Because I have another question from the audience. The question is, do you have a view as to whether essay questions versus other forms of questions are the most useful in eliciting useful socioeconomic information about an applicant? I'll throw that back to you, Cristina, since you were just talking, or anyone else who wants to chime in, of course.
Yeah, we don't have an extensive list of questions. I know Berkeley asks a lot of questions. Our application is not as extensive. So for us, the essays are really a great way for us to learn more about the student. And every year we take a look at our questions and say, can we ask this differently? Is there anything that we can add? But we don't have anything specifically, targeted towards socioeconomic status. But that's always on the table for us to consider.
Actually, since you were just mentioned, so to speak, Kristin, what would you see, like you've got different types of applicant, obviously everyone is different, but what would you say about in response?
Yeah, so I've become fairly accustomed to sort of Berkeley being like an outlier in a variety of ways. And this is a good example of that. Even our personal statement is an outlier. We have a 4-page personal statement limit, which was actually a direct outcome of sort of an overhaul post 2009. So we do have a diversity statement, and we do have a socioeconomic questionnaire that's fairly extensive, both of which are optional. The diversity statement is not about your diversity as sort of a set or an individual fixed characteristic or immutable characteristic. It's about your diversity specifically in terms of your contribution. And so it says that, how do you feel that your perspective, experience, or voice contribute diversity or will contribute diversity in our classrooms and community? Feel free to address any factors or attributes you consider important and relevant. In the past, applicants have included information about such things as gender identity, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, disability, socioeconomic background, being first generation, college student or graduate student, being a student parent, a reentry student, their geographic diversity or ideological diversity, and others. And you get all kinds of interesting responses and lots of no responses. And we admit people every year who don't write a diversity statement. It is entirely optional. And then we have an optional socioeconomic questionnaire, which again was sort of a direct result of that period of massive overhaul following the passage of 209 in 1997. And it asks, it's lengthy, and people can fill out part of it. They can fill out none of it, or they can fill out all of it. And I imagine you can sort of guess a little bit what's on it. Some of the questions might surprise you a little bit. We ask not just about the high school you attended for the longest period and the zip code of where you lived during high school, but also how many of your friends dropped out of high school before graduating, roughly. How many of your friends went on to 2 or 4 year college? Where did you go to community college? How many hours were you typically employed? Did you have primary responsibility for caretaking of children or others? How many people lived in your home, siblings, whether your parents were single parents, their education level, going back to sort of grade school, owning or renting, receiving public assistance, receiving an Pell Grant, receiving some other sort of California-specific grants, Cal Grant A and Cal Grant B, and income of your household at the time that you attended high school, where you were in high school for the majority of your childhood years. So it's lengthy, and it was, I think you can get a sense that we pretty quickly realized that we care about, as a public institution, access to the legal education that Berkeley provides. And that's not about access based on race, but we understand that there are lots of structures that inhibit the ability of people who are lower income to achieve something like admission to Berkeley Law. And it would be helpful to have context. It's particularly helpful to understand it as context around academic achievement, at school attended, and other kinds of responsibilities. So it can be helpful. To be clear, it is not a scored or scaled adversity tool. So
Okay.
there are some places that have done that, including some UCs. There is no formula here. We don't give points or deduct points for anything. We simply take it into consideration if people have responded at the time of a holistic review.
So, one of the questions we had in the first session, and actually, I guess came a couple different ways we didn't get to, but it asked about how to phrase questions to allow candidates to tell their personal story. And I guess that seems to be thematically what we're talking about here at the moment, getting to understand the personal story of each applicant. So I guess, there is that, I guess I'll ask a two-part question. First is, what tips would you give? And I think you were just talking about it, Kristin, but I guess if Cary or Cristina want to add more, what would you advise folks to say to get to know the students? This is, I think, frankly, a big picture question about admissions. How do you ask questions to make sure you know students as well as possible? The second part to it, with what we were just talking about, is part of what we're talking about now. It sounds like that there's a lot of investment of time, energy in this, and so let's talk about that as well. So let's go to Arizona and see what thoughts about how do you again, generally speaking, how do we find good questions? How can we craft good questions? But also, like, it's a lot of investment of time, energy, money, et cetera, isn't it?
It is, and actually that's a point I wanted to make, because there's a fine balance here, I think, especially when we're talking about the application and all of the optional questions or statements that people can give us, the questions themselves on the application. I think there's you have to think about it, and every school's different, right? And even within a state, with several law schools, every school is different, and so it depends on it goes back to your core values, your admissions policy, your mission statement. But because you want to ask enough questions that you feel like you can get a full picture of an applicant, but you don't want to ask so many questions that it discourages someone from completing your application. And so that's what I mean when I say there's a fine balance there. And so that's how I approach that particular topic, and when it comes to the actual application itself and the information that we're asking for.
And then in terms of the information you're asking for, how is it that your process goes? Just to step into the process, we've heard during this conversation, of course, and we all know we talk about a holistic review of the file. What does that look like in Arizona?
Well, it's like I said a couple of questions ago, when we're sitting down to read a file, we're looking for reasons to bring somebody into our community, and not to exclude them. And so we're looking at all the things we ask for. And I have this conversation a lot with potential applicants and visitors who come here to visit. And I spend a lot of time talking with pre-law advisors as well, because they have an important role in helping guide students through the law school application process. But how I talk about it when I'm talking with a prospective applicant is, we're not asking you to give us all of this information just to give it. We have reasons we're asking for it. There's a reason we want to see your transcripts. And that goes back to Kristin's earlier point of what is an academic record beyond the UGPA. So that's why we're asking for your transcripts, so we can take a deep dive and make some assessments about those. One of the ones that I think applicants are like, well, why are you asking me for my resume? We're asking for your resume. We want to see what you've been up to, because that helps to give us a picture of who you are as an individual. And so when I say holistic file review, we're looking at all of those little pieces of things that we've asked you to give us, and some that are optional that you can give us, to get a fuller picture of who you are as a person.
Very helpful. Thank you. Cristina, follow up on that too?
Yeah, I'll say for our process, the way we explain it to students is also, we have a holistic review, but nothing is scored. You don't get a point for X or a point for Y, right? Because I think there's a sense that, if I have this, that's an extra point. If I don't have this, it's a minus. And so we let them know that the process is we give the reviewer your file, and their job is to review every piece of information and then make a recommendation, admit, deny, or waitlist. And that means that they have to go through every piece of information and make a decision. It's not about scoring. It's about taking a look at everything combined before they make a decision. So we really try to impress that upon students so they don't focus just on one piece of the application, thinking that if they can just get this high LSAT or this high GPA or have this internship, that's what's going to set them, over the line and be admitted. That it really is taking a look at the entire application in totality before a decision is made.
And so let me go into the Q&A for a second. And so actually some which we have previously, I'll bring from the previous conversation, but also I think it is one of the questions here, talks about pipelines. Do you, and I'll start with you, Kristin. Tell us about any pipeline programs or the value of pipeline programs or any that you might use, and how you think they can be helpful in the process.
Yeah, I mean, I think interesting that you would come to me first. I have feelings about pipeline programs.
I came to you because the other two had just been speaking, so
no, it's fine. No, we do have several. We have a partnership with our public policy school, and we have through their PPIA or Public Policy International Affairs program, where we have law fellows who are interested in law and policy issues. Interestingly, as sort of a tip kind of for approaching this, they had to overhaul that program has typically been extremely racially and ethnically diverse, and they had to overhaul it separately from us. And they changed the admissions criteria a long time ago to a requirement that you have a demonstrated commitment to serving underserved racial groups. You do not need to be from one, but that somewhere in your resume and there's actually an essay that explicitly asks, how do you demonstrate a commitment to serving underserved racial groups? And it enunciates which ones they're talking about, actually, beyond being vague about it. And of course, that means we get lots of people, including people who are not members of minority groups who are in the class, but who are committed to that project. So that's a group that comes in the summer and lives in the dorms, and sort of this immersive thing, which I think it's really helpful to have people come onto your campus. For example, not just to sell your campus, but to have them be able to picture themselves in law school. We do a lot of partnerships, right? We tend to try to do pipeline work with other schools, either on campus or other law schools, in part because, we're always going to have a problem of people thinking they can't get into Berkeley. And it's really helpful to have like a whole range of schools to talk about what we offer, and to get different people in the door. There are plenty of people who might come thinking they want to go to Berkeley and decide that they're really mostly interested in a different school, or the reverse. So it helps to partner. You get much wider reach. There are lots of great pipeline programs out there that already exist. I think the thing that's tricky about pipeline programs is it's difficult to measure the success or the return on them. And you really have to, I think, as an admissions professional, including working with your dean, be very intentional about towing the line. This is not about a pipeline into your school. This is about diversifying the profession and the applicant pool. And so you cannot measure success by how many people enroll in your school the following year or the following 2 years, because that's when you get pipeline programs that only exist for a very short time. And then the dean says, I don't really see the payoff of this. It has to be about a broader good that you're contributing to the diversification of the pool, largely.
Okay. To continue on that, as we're talking about sort of the process, I have a question in the from one of our attendees. It says, would one of the panelists please walk us through the concrete steps as to how they then select applications that move forward in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I can talk about it somewhat specifically, and I'll maybe explain how it's changed. One of the things that is often true, and you may be watching this, experiencing this at your school, is many people start to think, well, we should change the reviewers. And we often hear proposals to have students involved in review or to have faculty involved in review in different kinds of ways. When we were chatting ahead of time, we all realized that at some point we did perhaps some version of that, and now we run an administrative process, and you can draw whatever conclusions from that you wish to draw. When a file comes in, one important point that I would make is obviously wait for it to be complete and we assign it to a reviewer, but we do not engage in what I would call steering or presumptive steering. So we don't take something like an index score, which is typically a school-based formula, which combines high GPA and high LSAT score into something that we call an index. And we do not say people with this index and above are presumptive admits, people with this index and below are presumptive denies, and everyone in the middle is kind of like, I don't know, and then give, Cary the presumptive admits and Cristina the presumptive denies. In part because I think when you tell someone there's a presumption, it creates a sort of predetermined outcome in large part, but in part because, I'm fairly risk averse. And I think it would be, it's sort of, someone's immediately going to ask, show me everybody who went from presumptive deny to being admitted when you did it based on numbers. So we just don't do that at all. You get a random assignment of files. There are real upsides to this, actually, because it's very helpful when training readers to do holistic review to allow them to be surprised, to allow them to read somebody with a 179 and a 4.0 who you do not want in your school, and to allow them to read somebody with a 149 and a 3.5 who you do. And if you don't allow people to kind of see the whole pool, I think you miss out an opportunity for training and having that be informed. My reviewers, once they review, they make an initial recommendation. All of those files come back to me. And ultimately, I'm acting on the delegation of Irwin's authority, right? And it's my, when I click admit, it's LDA, it's law dean admit, or LDD, law dean deny. So those decisions really ultimately flow back with me. And I will finally say just that I think that there's a lot of investment that needs to happen in training. If you have been doing it kind of fast, mostly we presume these people are getting in and maybe 10% don't. Mostly we presume these people are not getting in and a few do. It's going to take a lot longer when you can't approach it that particular way. But that's how we read files. And then obviously, because I'm a person who they have to flow back through, there's a great deal of auditing. There's a great deal of sort of conversational back and forth between me and my team, and some sort of norming to a certain extent. I also have the benefit of, in the last about 50 years, we've only had 3 deans of admissions. And so there's a lot of historical knowledge about kind of what we're looking for that extends quite far back. And obviously not everyone's going to be in that position.
Thank you. And to build on that, let me turn to Cristina for a second for something we had talked about. What can admissions officers do to manage expectations of faculty, alums, current students, or other stakeholders?
Yes, there's going to be a lot of conversations. Now that it's on a bigger stage, right? Everyone knows about what's going on. When it was, just a few states that had this, a lot of people were just very confused about our process. But I think now that everyone's heard about it on the news, everyone has, seen the talk shows, they understand the implications of what this will have for everyone. But I think it's important to, have those conversations. I know some schools have sent out emails, reaffirming their commitment to diversity, reaffirming their commitment to their holistic review process. So those things I think need to happen. But admissions officers still need to be prepared for the blowback, right? Things may change, and unfortunately your office is going to be the one that's going to get that email or get the phone call first. And so having data at your hands to show folks, to show alums or other stakeholders about what's been going on nationally and how that's affected your application pool. And so just having that information ready, and I think this is also an opportunity to, it's kind of a rallying cry for all of those stakeholders as well, is we are now as a whole challenged with this decision. So what do we as a group, faculty, staff, alums, current students, what do we do as a community to ensure that we're still a place that all diverse students want to be at? And so it's an opportunity to say we need your help now more than before. And that we need you to be part of that solution. And so that's what I'm hoping will happen with some of our, alums and faculty, is that they will see that how we're being challenged and will help us and, right, be part of that solution that we need. We can't over rely on our current students to be those ambassadors. They are students, they have very little bandwidth. And so it's going to be really on us, the admissions office, the faculty, and our alumni to really step up and help us in that recruitment process. It's getting a lot harder for our current students to participate in that. And so this is a time to let those stakeholders know we need your help now more than ever. We can't just depend on our current students to do that work for us.
So let me ask in sort of combining different questions. What to do in light specifically of this decision, and part of that is things you might need to do differently and things you might need to do the same. So you know, how do you see that you can best, part of one of these questions, demonstrate that you're complying with the new restrictions? I think because you know, there's a question about whether schools were within or exceeding the Grutter decision. The question which you have faced for years within your own state constraints, or whether you are within or exceeding those constraints. So how do you think you can demonstrate compliance with the law, and that, you know, I'm not asking you to be general counsel, but you know, do you think there are ways that, you know, that may be like part of the previous point that Cristina was making about just the conversations you have, but you know, how do you deal with that? Different people's, I guess, sense of compliance with what the court or another state law has said you must do. Stumper of a question for all three.
Yeah, we're just used to, you just have to call on us because nobody ever in admissions wants to talk over anybody else. It's like a rule of panels.
Well,
Yeah,
go ahead, Kristin.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And it's, you know, it's a balance too of not being like overly reactive. I think a lot of us, you know, and people may have seen, like, have already received a letter over email that's sort of like, you will only consider LSATs and GPAs, which is just wrong. I mean, so maybe the first thing is the most obvious one, which is make sure that you've read the decision, and you can talk to people within your own school. You can talk to your general counsel, you can talk to others, you could talk to some of us. And, you know, nobody's going to tell you other than your general counsel what they will or won't do. But you also have to get a sense, I think, from an admissions perspective with your dean of their risk tolerance, because there is some ambiguity that remains, right? So the call about having a diversity statement, I don't know what your call is. You can see on this panel that, like, I made a call and Cary and Cristina made a different call, or at least our schools did. So, you know, I heard this characterized as by, I think it was Sean Harper at USC, that to resist rhetorical overreach. And I think that is important. If, you know, and then to be prepared. I mean, as I said, like, we were all public institutions. We know what it is to have responsive documents and to respond to Public Records Act requests. I think that all of these schools that put out statements about, you know, their ongoing commitment, it would be interesting to see if they follow that up with additional statements or things on their website about their actual plans for, you know, both compliance and preservation of diversity, or sort of a 2 or 3 year planning process that might take place. Or, but yeah, I think you have to know what the decision actually says, and I'm sure you and Erwin did a good job of enunciating that in the previous session.
We tried. We definitely tried. Let me shift perspectives for a second. We have a couple of questions in from a student perspective. So let's change that perspective. One person says, how do you recommend that diverse or minority applicants navigate or change their approach to the application process? Another one says, I've heard advice to mention other dimensions of diversity other than my race as a person of color, such as unique skills or talents. You know, so I think both those are questions are thinking about what would you say to a student as we look at this. And obviously, we are talking about tens of thousands of students who apply to law school every year. So there's no one monolithic student, but I guess I'll turn to you, Cary, and see any thoughts in reaction to those questions that have been posed to us.
Sure. The second question first about highlighting more than racial diversity. I think this has kind of been a theme of our conversation for the past hour, which is more in the law school application. So you don't have to exclude one thing in order to include other things when you're talking about your background. So including other types of diversity beyond or alongside talking about, your racial background is a good thing, because it gives us, like we've been talking about, another piece or many more pieces of the puzzle to consider who you are in a holistic manner and trying to make a decision about you. So the second question, that's the answer, I think. In terms of the first question, talk to law schools. Applicants should just talk to law schools. Call us, email us, come to our events or come to events where we are and ask us these questions. We're happy to have these conversations with applicants in this framework, one-on-one or in group settings. But a lot of times it is a very individual question that you're going to be talking to a person. Of the tens of thousands of applicants, everybody's different. And so that conversation in particular, what you need to be telling us about yourself, is really going to depend on who you are as an individual, and that conversation is very specific. But the overall piece of advice there, I think, is to talk to us, talk to the admissions office at the law schools that people are really considering.
Great. Thank you for that. Let me turn to something which I know I'll start with Kristin, then go to Cristina. Talk about the process of the post-admission process. So, we always, there's obviously many phases, but, we've talked a little bit about building the pool, pipelines, then into the application process itself. We've talked about that some, that we're just talking about right now. How does a student apply? We've talked about the review. What about that last phase, once we have admitted? We talk about the yield factor. So, what are some of the things that you do related to yield? And I know you all have had an interest in it, but I'll start with Kristin, then go to Cristina for yield tools or recommendations.
Yeah, when I first started at Berkeley, my role was explicitly focused on outreach and recruitment. And I remember my predecessor saying to me, I'm primarily worried about which X number of people we're admitting, but it's your job to make sure the right 300 come. Right. And so recruitment is incredibly important. That being said, I do think recruitment is impacted by Proposition 209. It's impacted by this decision, either as it relates to scholarship, which is often an important tool for individuals and for schools to help close the deal, but also to other kinds of things that you just might want to think about downstream. So, for example, one of the approaches that I use for Proposition 209 is that I can't confer a benefit based on race, right? I can't run one report for fee waivers that says, show me people of this race with this GPA, and I'll give them a fee waiver, and then raise the GPA for another group of people. It's just not going to survive any kind of scrutiny. So for Admitted Students Weekend, for example, this is another place in which things get more expensive. We provide everybody who wants to come and visit with a travel stipend. We don't provide some people with a travel stipend, either tied to diversity or tied to ELSA. It's everyone who wants to come to visit. When we do events, we do actually host something called diversity family dinners in certain cities. It's an all-comers policy. We're not going to tell people, people self-identify with that term. But we also don't host them in any cities where we are not also hosting another sort of like large firm reception, so that every admitted student has an opportunity to engage with alumni and leadership of the law school and to participate in sort of a local regional alumni recruitment event. So there's just all kinds of places. And I do think it's important. We've been very focused on kind of the decision. And obviously, if people are not getting in, that's first order of business. But at the back end too, there's probably a lot of your practices that are not going to be very well articulated in a policy document or others that you sort of need to do a full inventory of. They may be perfectly fine, and there may be others that you change. One thing I would highlight that we did is eliminated seat deposit. And it did a lot of things. I personally believe I can't charge enough in a seat deposit to keep a very wealthy person from walking away from it, but it's going to keep plenty of low-income people from being able to say yes, or to explore all of their options. And so we just don't, your word is your bond in our industry, and it is in this particular process as well. There are lots of other kinds of things using current students, whether you have ambassadors that you pay or whether you use volunteers. We made a move some years ago to provide pro bono hours for people who were doing certain kinds of admissions volunteer work to qualify for summer public interest funding, so that regardless of whether they were paid ambassadors or not, that they were not sort of doing uncompensated labor in a particular kind of way. There's a ton that can be done at that part of the process. The relationships, the outreach from faculty, the outreach from alumni. We have a matching system, and all students get contacted by a current student, by an alumni, by faculty. You just kind of want to leverage everything you possibly can, but also make sure that things that you've done in the past are things that would still be viable given the new landscape.
Thank you. Cristina?
Yeah, very, very similar to Kristin. So we, our budget is different, right? So we, that's one thing that I think we've kind of said is, these things are expensive. Recruitment can be very expensive, aside from just the scholarship portion. But putting together one or more admitted students days, that's very expensive. We also do offer travel stipends because we find that once students can get to campus and see us, talk to us, be in the building, really see themselves at the school, that has helped a lot of students, get to yes with us. And so the travel stipends are there. It's a big portion of our budget, but it's what helps students, come to our school, and that could definitely make a difference. We do work with our current students. We do a lot of virtual webinars, post-COVID, it's what's easier and what's been helpful, especially for those students who can't come to campus, who live on the other side of the country or for other reasons can't make it. And so we have our student organizations. So for students interested in business law, we're going to have a webinar with, our business law group. And so we do a lot of, kind of interest group webinars for current students to connect. Using our ambassadors as well. We haven't used our faculty and alumni as much over the last few years. A lot of it COVID, folks just kind of went away for a while. We're hoping to get them more engaged, but previously we would also do the same, have faculty, alumni, and students contact our students, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for those connections with the students and faculty, and we find that can definitely make a difference. So that's where we really try to invest our time. But I have a very small office. There's only 3 of us in my office, so we can only do so much in the admissions office, and so it's really important that for those who are on this webinar, who are faculty or are alums or whatnot, to please get involved. If that admissions office is very small, it's a big endeavor to try to do it on your own.
And actually, to that point, to follow up, there are limited resources, and that actually a question that did just come in too. What do you do if you have, if we all have limited resources, what if you have particularly limited resources? And obviously schools are differently resourced, economically speaking. So I would ask you, Cristina, to follow up. Other than trying to get the dean to find more money in the budget or raise it somehow, what recommendations? But it could also be that maybe that is the answer. Tell the dean to find money in the budget. What do you think, Cristina?
I would say yes to that. Absolutely. Deans, please, find us some money. But if you have limited resources, your people are going to be your best resource, right? And so that is going to be your faculty and your students and your alumni. And so as we talk about, how do we manage expectations? How do we prepare for what's coming? This is the time to say, we're going to be challenged. It's going to be a different challenge for all of us. And so this is a time to say, let's start thinking about what we can do as a group, right? We have limited resources. So how much time are you willing to invest? How much, what are you willing to do to help the admissions office? Because we have limited resources and you are our best resource. And so getting them involved early in the process, I think will be helpful as we start talking about what challenges and what to expect coming forward. But yes, having a bigger budget will always help.
And let me follow up still with that, Cary. Just one of the questions from an attendee is, given limited resources, do you use administrative review for admissions, or do you use faculty or students? So just what is your experience in that regard?
So I've been at two different schools in my career. The school that I came from was a very heavy faculty review committee, and with lots of meeting and file review and discussion. But at Arizona, our process is similar to what Kristin described for Berkeley. There are faculty on our admissions committee, but I'm the final arbiter of what happens with a file. But we do have students on our admissions committee. They're third-year law students, so they won't be there. They won't be still at the school when the first years come in. I was kind of skeptical when I came here because that's been a long-standing tradition at Arizona. But I love having students be a part of the process. They get holistic file review, I think, much more quickly than the other people who might be on the committee. And so that's one of the things I like. And so if you're a school who doesn't have that, maybe you might consider adding some students to your file review process. I mean, there are parameters around the files that they see, especially as it pertains to bar related questions that we all ask. But that's been a great experience that I've had.
Great. So now we are at the point where we've got 4 minutes left. So let me just take a quick go around with each of the three of you. What is something that you want to make sure we know before we sign off? So if you can think something I have not yet gotten to, or that you really wanted to say, I've tried to get through the attendee questions and your own ideas, but quick go around, something that you want to make sure we know before we sign off here, and then we'll see if we've got more time for other questions. So I'll go back, I'll go to Cary, Cristina, and Kristin.
I think I'll end with what I started with is a lot of us have looked this problem square in the eye before, or this issue, and have come up with creative solutions to maintain the kinds of classes that we want. This is just another moment in time where we have to stop and reassess. And even schools who live in states like the three of us do, who've been under this type of law before, we still have to reassess this after this decision. We still have to go back to the drawing board and talk to our general counsel and do all the things that we've been encouraging the participants to do today. But this is an unknown space for everybody who's on this particular webinar. And so I find that to be a very affirming thing to me, and not necessarily positive, but very affirming that we've been here before. We know how to look at this problem and we'll figure it out.
Cristina.
I'll say this is a marathon, not a race, right? So I think that the impulse right now is to make 100 changes and hope that something works. But you have to really take stock of what resources you have and what your bandwidth is. And so don't feel like you need to make 1,000 changes right off the bat. Start with your admissions policies, start with your application, get people involved in the process. I think that will help to then guide you as you go along in this work. But I think being too impulsive and making too many changes is probably not the best way to do it. And remember that you have a lot of people that you can turn to ask questions about. We don't have all the answers. I won't say that we do it perfectly, but we try to do the best that we can. And a lot of it is just trying things out, seeing if they work, and if not, moving on to the next opportunity.
Thank you, Kristin.
Yeah, not dissimilarly, I would say this is deeply iterative. It's going to be constant reassessment. And I'll just pick up on one thing that was in the previous question related to limited resources and budget. I think embracing data and analysis is critical. So for example, asking the question of, okay, well, this happened, we only enrolled, after admissions, we only enrolled 12 African-American students. There's all kinds of people that have all kinds of opinions about what went wrong. Data is your friend. What was the national applicant pool like? How many applications did you get? What were the outcomes of those applications? And then what was the yield rate on those individuals? Because if you can't do everything, trying to assess whether or not it's better to do more outreach related things to get people to come as applicants, or whether it's better to do something that's related to yield because you weren't converting people from admits to matriculants, becomes a really high stakes question. And every year it might be a little bit different. So it's not like you can do it once and then sort of go, okay, well, we have it figured out. We won't have to change anything for 10 years. You have to do it constantly. And so that also just may be, as you go through this for the next few years, one of my big recommendations is to invest in the kind of data and analysis and data visualization and other tools to help you understand some of those kinds of questions. I do a surprising amount of research, and then also we do a surprising amount of piloting things where we try them and then we look at what happened, and then we decide if we're going to continue to do them or change them or reject them entirely. But it's a lot of work.
Thank you. And we are just coming up. We've got so many questions still, of course, people asking about legacy admits, veteran status, age, other ways we consider students, which I think is extraordinarily important as we consider the overall success of a class, for lack of a better term. Many more questions, which will continue. I think that was one of the points that's made a few times. This is not just a one moment in time. As always, we want to make sure we are complying with the law and bring in the strongest class as possible. I mean, the reality is the Supreme Court made a declaration that there are certain admissions programs that were being reviewed and they did not meet constitutional scrutiny based on their consideration of race. They did not declare what any of our values happen to be. They did not say what we have to care about. They did not say what a class should look like or must look like. We all have our own goals, needs, priorities. And so what we've talked about here is what do we do? And in this context, I appreciate that we have had three individuals with great experience, great insights, who have talked about the tools available at our disposal and how we move forward after these decisions. So I'm grateful to the three of you for speaking with us today. And I will volunteer you, which I think you did by being on this panel, to continue in this context. I appreciate you are willing to do this panel today. I appreciate all who have been on this panel. We'll be on a 15-minute break now before returning to the third panel, which will be about open questions. So thank you all very much. We'll see you again.